It didn't begin with shouting. Or marching. Or the familiar chorus of a divided nation sharpening its teeth again. No, it began with silence. A silence so heavy it felt intentional. Engineered. Like the pause before a verdict. It was a cool morning in America, one of those mornings that pretends to be ordinary. Sky washed in soft gold. Birdsong weaving through quiet suburbs. Coffee shops sliding open like nothing in the world was changing. The city moved, slow, confident, unaware. But somewhere beneath the calm, a truth was shifting. A page in history was curling at the edges, ready to burn. Someone would later say. The world didn't end that day. It simply turned, and half the country didn't feel it. They'd call this moment a celebration. A transition. A peaceful passing of the torch. But the streets told another story. Flags waved like triumph. Faces glowed with relief, or resentment, or something stranger, resignation. And in the crowd, a man stood still. A man once seen as a storm, now silent. The dreamer. The disruptor. The one who dared to speak the part of America most pretended wasn't there. He didn't raise his voice today. He didn't argue. He didn't fight the cameras, or the headlines, or the carefully curated future being packaged for the American mind. He simply watched. Eyes not furious, but cold. Focused. As if he'd finally seen the machine operating without disguise. And for the first time, the country didn't cheer him or boo him. It just looked away. Ignored him. Like a phase. A storm they believed had passed. But storms don't disappear. They relocate. They grow. They wait. That morning, he didn't lose power. He surrendered something deeper, belief in the game. The applause roared. Hands clapped. Confetti floated like engineered hope. But his face didn't break. Not once. Because in that moment, he understood. The fight was never about the office. It was about who decides the story. And he had just realized. It wasn't him. History loves noise. Revolutions. Declarations. Fury painted across walls and timelines. But the most dangerous shifts. They happen quietly. A signature. A handshake. A nod behind tinted glass. The public celebrates. The cameras flash. The machine exhales. And someplace unseen, the future pivots. That's what this was. A turn. Not a collapse. Not yet. Just a soft rotation of power, influence, narrative. A realignment. A reminder. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it thanks you for your cooperation. He left the stage not defeated, but altered. You could feel it in his steps. Measured. Clipped. Like a man learning to walk again in a world that suddenly isn't his. There was no anger in him now. Only clarity. Clarity is colder than rage. More dangerous. More efficient. And as he disappeared behind the curtain, a question rippled through the air. Soft, ominous, inevitable. What happens when the man who refused to bow, finally turns his back instead? Because that day, he didn't break. He didn't surrender. He didn't fall. He turned away. And turning away is worse than fighting. It means you've stopped believing the battlefield matters. And are preparing a new one. Outside, the crowd cheered the beginning of a new era. The headlines were already drafting their victory songs. Cable news smiled like the world had been repaired overnight. But deep inside homes across America, something twisted. Not anger. Not yet. Just a chill. A quiet instinct whispering. Something isn't right. Something just shifted, and we didn't see it, we only felt it. Mothers paused at the sink. Fathers hovered over the morning paper. Young men and women scrolling feeds slowed just slightly. A hesitation between one thumb motion and the next. A ripple across a nation trying to convince itself it was safe again. But safety built on silence is not safety. It is a staged calm. A calm enforced, not earned. A calm that hides the gears turning behind velvet curtains. And every empire knows. False peace is the most efficient prison. Later, commentators would call it unity. Diplomats would call it stability. Celebrities would call it healing. But historians, the honest ones, would call it something else. A moment of divergence. The quiet birth of a parallel path. The day the dream cracked, not from pressure, but from rejection. Because this wasn't about politics anymore. Not ideology. Not policy. Not red or blue. It was about belief. Faith in the promise. Trust in the system. And millions felt it slipping, slow enough to ignore. But real enough to fear. They wouldn't riot. They wouldn't storm. Not today. They would simply wake up different tomorrow. More aware. Less convinced. A little colder. Like a nation hearing a lock click from the inside. He once stood for the idea that the people still held the match. The spark. The final word. But that day. He saw the truth. The match was never in their hands. It was borrowed. Loaned. Allowed, temporarily, under supervision. And the moment he became inconvenient. The hand that offered the match took it back. Not with force. With celebration. And in that irony. The most American irony imaginable. The crowd applauded the end of their own fire. Somewhere across the country, a diner TV whispered the ceremony. A truck engine idled as the radio hummed along. An old veteran at a quiet breakfast paused his fork mid-air. Not because he lost his side. But because he felt something deeper. That sense only people who have lived long enough recognize. The story just changed. And the narrator wasn't us anymore. A republic doesn't fall in a battlefield. It fades in a ballroom. With champagne. And polite applause. And cameras smiling like guardians of truth. But cameras don't protect truth. They protect power. And that morning, power smiled back at itself. So let me ask you. Not as a commentator. Not as a strategist. But as a fellow citizen breathing the same trembling air. What would you do? If your world changed quietly. And you were told to celebrate. Would you clap along? Would you doubt your own instincts? Would you pretend not to feel the shift under your feet? Because everyone else seemed convinced it was progress? Or would you pause? Think. Listen to the silence between the cheers. The truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper. Be careful what you celebrate. Because some victories are just well-lit endings. Hit subscribe and tell me. What would you do? If your world changed overnight? The curtain fell. The applause echoed. The city glowed like nothing had happened. But in that calm, something fundamental fractured. A leader walked away. A nation exhaled, not in peace, but in uncertainty. And quietly. Quietly. America stepped into a new story. A story written not by voices. But by silence. And that's when everything changed. Before the storm, there was a man. Not a myth. Not a headline. Not the symbol he would become. Just a man. Tired eyes. A restless heartbeat. A mind that refused to sleep when the world felt wrong. He wasn't born into the fire, he walked into it. On purpose. Knowing the burn was part of the bargain. Because somewhere deep in his bones, long before crowds chanted his name, or enemies sharpened their teeth, he carried a simple American belief. If the system belongs to the people should still feel it. But he didn't start with power. He started the way most stories worth telling do. With doubt. With a quiet ache. With a life that had given him everything, yet somehow still demanded more. Not wealth. Not status. Meaning. Purpose. The kind you don't inherit. You earn by confronting the thing everyone else avoids. The truth behind the curtain. His early days weren't forged in marble halls, or framed by Ivy League portraits, or backlit by dynasties dripping with heritage. No. He grew in noise. In grit. In the real, unpolished America where dreams don't whisper. They roar. Business wasn't his ambition. It was his battlefield. A place where rules weren't written in textbooks. They were carved into flesh. Success wasn't applause. It was survival. He failed big. He won big. He gambled bigger. Not reckless. Relentless. Because he believed in the American ladder. The idea that if you climbed hard enough, if you bled long enough, if you refused to kneel, you could touch the sky. But as he climbed, the air got colder. Not because the summit was harsh, but because fewer people belonged there. And slowly, painfully, he began to see. The ladder wasn't built for everyone. It was a museum piece. Polished, admired, guarded. Most Americans didn't climb it. They stared at it through glass. And so the dreamer became the fighter. Not for himself. He had already climbed. But for those who never even got to touch the first rung. People say he loved the spotlight. Maybe he did. But spotlight is just another word for witness. He didn't crave attention. He craved proof. That someone still cared enough to look. Because in a world drowning in screens and slogans, indifference is the most efficient weapon. He spoke loudly. Because silence was the default state of the forgotten. He provoked. Because comfort breeds blindness. He broke rules. Because rules had stopped serving the people who needed them most. He wasn't polished. He wasn't patient. He wasn't gentle. But gentle men rarely move mountains. And somewhere deep inside, whether you loved him or hated him, you recognized something ancient. He was not created by politics. He was created by neglect. A nation ignored too long will eventually answer with a roar. He was that roar. A flawed one. A human one. But real. And real, in an era of curated illusions, is radioactive. When he first stepped toward power, the machine laughed. A novelty, they said. A joke. A spark in the night. Bright for a moment. Gone by morning. But sparks don't disappear. They travel. They seek oxygen. They search for the dry places history forgot to water. And when they find them, they ignite. He didn't create the fire. America was already smoldering. He just spoke the flame into view. And suddenly, millions who felt invisible. Felt seen. Not coddled. Not pitted. Seen. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't about ideology. It was about a voice. Magnifying the quiet frustration that had been building beneath polished promises and corporate smiles. And in that moment, he was not the dreamer. He was the mirror. And mirrors are dangerous. Not because of what they show, but because of what they expose. Of course, power doesn't grant audiences. It audits them. The machine watched. Listened. Calculated. At first amused. Then unnerved. Then threatened. Because he wasn't supposed to win. Not by their math. Not by their rules. But he did. And when he entered the palace built for the few, he walked like a man who hadn't forgotten the many. Some called it arrogance. Others called it justice. He called it necessary. He didn't arrive to join the elite. He arrived to disrupt them. And disruption is rarely forgiven. Especially by those who believe power is their birthright. But beneath the storms, beneath the rallies and rhetoric and chaos and noise, there was something quieter. Almost invisible. Loneliness. Real leadership always contains it. Not the lonely feeling of absence, but the gravity of responsibility. The weight of knowing. You're carrying people who can no longer carry themselves. He never said it. He never showed it. But the man who speaks for millions sleeps alone with the consequences. Greatness is not built from ego. It is built from burden. And every time he looked out across a crowd, every time he heard the roar that shook arenas like thunder, there was another sound too. A quiet question echoing in the part of his mind no one ever sees. Who will stand with me when the cheering stops? Because eventually, it always stops. And when it did, on that ceremony morning when the world turned away, the answer revealed itself. No one. Not the system. Not the institutions. Not the guardians of democracy or defenders of tradition. He had been useful. He had been disruptive. He had been feared. But useful is not loved. Feared is not honored. And disruptors are tolerated. Until the disruption becomes inconvenient. That's when the door closes. Not with force. With politeness. With ceremony. With a smile. So who was he before he turned away? A builder. A challenger. A believer in a nation's promise. Even when the nation stopped believing in itself. Flawed. Absolutely. What human isn't? Messy. Undeniably. Change never arrives clean. But real? More real than the polished scripts offered by those who speak for power instead of truth. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a savior. He was something far rarer in modern America. A man who believed the country still belonged to the people. And acted accordingly. And for a moment in history. A brief, electric, impossible moment. Millions believed it with him. Until the day the world clapped him off stage. And called it healing. Every man has a turning point. A moment where the dream doesn't die. It hardens. Where faith doesn't vanish. It evolves. And that's where he stood now. Not defeated. But transformed. The dreamer had become the witness. The believer had become the question. The fighter had become the observer. Waiting, watching, learning. What happens when a nation decides comfort is safer than truth? A page turned. A light dimmed. A silence settled. And that's when everything changed again. Pause. Breathe. Remember this moment. Because every story has a turning point. And sometimes the turn begins not with fire. But with someone simply walking away. Before nations fall. Before systems calcify. Before freedoms become memories instead of expectations. There is always a hum. A faint vibration beneath ordinary life. You don't notice it at first. Not during the morning coffee. Not while scrolling headlines. Not while telling yourself the world still works. Because it looks like it's working. But beneath the noise. Beneath the applause. Beneath the smiling anchors on glowing screens, a quieter truth whispers. Something is shifting. And only those who've seen power up close recognize the sound. He heard it that morning. Not in the ceremony. Not in the speeches. Not in the perfectly rehearsed promises broadcast like lullabies to keep the country asleep. He heard it in the silence between claps. The pauses that lasted just a fraction too long. The plastic cheer that felt scripted. As if America wasn't celebrating a beginning, but sealing a vault. A vault that would soon close on every voice that dared to question the new narrative. He stepped off the stage. No roar. No drama. Just footsteps echoing in a hallway. Too clean, too white, too controlled. Power never looks like chaos on the inside. It looks like order. Sanitized. Sterile. Perfect. Perfect is dangerous. Perfect means the truth has been airbrushed. Perfect means dissent has been swept into locked drawers. Perfect means the machine finally stopped tolerating friction. And the friction they could no longer afford, was now free to go. Not removed. Released. Exiled, not by force. By irrelevance. This is how power operates. When it no longer fears the people. Not with boots. But with a bow. Not with chains. But with applause. The most effective silencing is the one that pretends you were never necessary. He walked through the back corridors. The ones where cameras never go. Where real conversations happen. Where history is not performed, but negotiated. Once, people whispered when he passed. Not now. Now they observed him. Like an artifact being catalogued. Before storage. No hostility. Just removal. A smile here. A nod there. Diplomacy as erasure. And the message beneath every polite gesture. Thank you for your contribution. We'll take it from here. The door closed behind him. With a softness that felt louder than any slam. Outside, a motorcade waited. Black steel. Tinted glass. Engines humming the way power breathes. When it thinks no one can challenge it. He paused. Not for cameras. Not for theatrics. He paused because something inside him shifted. Not anger. Not humiliation. Recognition. This was not a transfer. This was a redirection. A quiet pivot in the architecture of power. History had not turned the page. The page had been replaced. In living rooms across the country. Screens glowed with celebration. Anchors leaned forward, smiling too wide. Experts congratulated each other on the restoration. Social feeds filled with declarations of renewal. But renewal, he knew, requires honesty. This was choreography. Paint over the cracks. Dim the lights. Play hopeful music. Tell the audience everything is fine. America wasn't healing. It was being sedated. And sedation can feel like peace. Right up until the world wakes up in restraints. There's a peculiar thing about turning points. You never feel them in your hands. You feel them in your bones. A veteran watching in a recliner felt it. The same knot he carried in jungles and deserts. When leaders smiled right before something irreversible happened. A single mother driving home from a double shift felt it. Not in anger. But in the deep exhaustion. Of someone who's seen hope packaged and sold too many times. A young man in a small town felt it. The one who believed the future was his. Until the future became a subscription service he couldn't afford. An immigrant entrepreneur felt it. Someone who came to America for freedom. And suddenly recognized the faint scent. Of the system he escaped. They couldn't explain it. Not yet. They just knew. Something is tightening. Something is narrowing. Something is changing. And we are not being told why. He sat in the back of the armored car. Hands still. Gaze steady. Not defeated. More dangerous. Because defeat ends movements. Disillusionment evolves them. He didn't curse. He didn't rant. He didn't spiral. He observed. Outside the window. America continued like it always does. Too busy surviving to notice the temperature changing. Democracy doesn't disappear when people are loud. It disappears when people are tired. And America was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of choosing. Tired of believing everything hung on the next vote. The next savior. The next promise. Tired people don't protest. They comply. Not because they trust the system. But because resistance requires energy. They no longer have. That morning. America didn't rise. It exhaled. A tired nation will accept anything. If you sell it as relief. Phones buzzed in pockets. Texts rolled in. Some gloating. Some mourning. Most indifferent. Indifference, he knew, is the soil where control grows fastest. But here's the thing about a man who has seen the machine up close. He doesn't fear losing power. He fears what happens when power stops being questioned. And now, finally, he understood his role wasn't finished. It was just uninvited. Movements don't die when leaders lose office. They die when leaders lose conviction. And in that back seat, with the future closing like a door behind tinted glass, his conviction sharpened. Not to return. Not to reclaim. To reveal. Because truth does not need office. Truth needs eyes willing to see. And a voice that refuses to go quiet. And silence. True silence. Is only frightening to those who depended on his noise. To distract from their schemes. He wasn't stepping away from the fight. He was stepping out of the arena. And sometimes the only way to expose a rigged game is to stop playing. A city skyline passed like a memory. Billboards. Glass towers. Flags waving as if everything underneath them still meant what it used to. He closed his eyes. Not in defeat. In calculation. A man doesn't turn away from power. Unless he's discovered something more valuable than power. Perspective. Perspective cracks illusions. Perspective rewrites roles. He was no longer the disruptor. He was the witness. And a witness with a platform is more dangerous than a king. Somewhere, a voice on television declared. America has been restored. Restored to what? To who? For whom? Restoration is a comforting word. It promises familiarity. It hides transformation. It shields agendas. And in a nation that worships progress, the quickest way to manipulate the future is to disguise control as comfort. The machine didn't defeat him. It declared itself unnecessary for him. That was the mistake. Because turning a man into an outsider doesn't erase him. It frees him. And every system throughout history has feared the moment the outsider stops trying to come back and starts preparing to reveal what he saw inside. Outside, a flag fluttered in the wind. Not triumphant. Not grieving. Waiting. A nation isn't broken when leaders fall. A nation is broken when people stop asking who lifted them. And why. The hum beneath America grew louder. Not in the streets. In the hearts. Something was coming. Not chaos. Not rebellion. Awakening. Because when power becomes absolute, Awareness becomes revolution. And that was the morning awareness was born. Everything looked normal. But normal had expired. And that was the day the cracks began to show. The question was never, who won? The question was always, who decides what winning means? And that's when the silence started to spread. At first, it was subtle. Power rarely storms in through the front door. It slips in through convenience. Comfort. The illusion of progress. The screens all glowed the same way. Same headlines. Same tone. Same promise. Everything is fine now. Repetition is not reassurance. Repetition is programming. And across the nation, people nodded. Not because they agreed. But because disagreement had become exhausting. Silence isn't compliance. Sometimes it's survival. He watched from a distance now. Not above. Not below. Beside. A man who once stood at the center of the storm. Now watched the clouds from the edge. Seeing the shape forming. Before lightning struck. Because when you've been inside the machine, you learn its heartbeat. And its heartbeat had changed. Rhythms grew, synchronized. Too synchronized. Different voices. Same language. Different faces. Same script. There's a moment when influence becomes coordination. And coordination becomes control. That moment had arrived. Quietly. Elegantly. Almost beautifully. Control doesn't always look like chains. Sometimes it looks like unity. But unity without dissent is not unity. It is obedience. In living rooms across America, families talked less. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they had too much to lose. What if a neighbor overheard? What if a phone was listening? What if disagreeing became dangerous again? Freedom doesn't disappear when laws change. It disappears when conversation does. And in that stillness, the nation didn't celebrate victory. It exhaled fear. The quiet kind. The polite kind. The kind that wears a smile in public. And questions itself in private. Is this what we wanted? Is this what we were promised? Questions whispered. Only in the shower. Or on long drives. Or to friends you trust more than your own future. They said the system was healing. He listened. Healing should feel like hope returning. Not voices fading. Healing is supposed to restore power to the people. Not remove the need for them. A repaired system invites scrutiny. A fortified system prevents it. And this system was fortifying itself. With velvet ropes instead of barbed wire. With applause instead of alarms. Nothing is more dangerous than a government praised for silence. Nothing looks more stable than a cage from the outside. He walked the streets now. Unescorted. Unfiltered. People approached him differently. Not with cheers. Not with anger. With hesitation. I didn't always agree with you. It always started that way. Like they were apologizing for thinking independently. But something feels off now. That was the refrain. Across diners, factories, airports, sidewalks. Not love. Not loyalty. Awakening. You can't fake intuition. And America's intuition was stirring. Not fast. Not loud. Slow. Deep. In the marrow. You can bury truth. But you cannot dissolve it. Like roots under concrete. It waits. Silent. Patient. Until one day. The surface cracks. A businessman whispered to him over breakfast. It's like everyone got the same memo overnight. A farmer at a gas station murmured. Feels like someone else is driving now. A teacher in a parking lot confessed. We stopped teaching kids how to think. We're teaching them what to think. A soldier, quiet eyes, steady voice, said only. I've seen this abroad. Different words. Same fear. Not of chaos. Of coordination. Freedom doesn't end in riots. It ends in agreement too perfect to question. The machine smiled everywhere. Commercials. Speeches. Social feeds. Corporate slogans aligning like constellations. Drawn by a hand no one voted for. Progressive. Modern. Unified. Everything you'd want to hear. If you believe control only comes wearing boots. And never wearing a brand. But power had evolved. And evolution doesn't roar. It whispers. You're safe. You're protected. We'll handle everything. Freedom traded for comfort. Isn't a compromise. It's a seduction. And seductions never announce their cost up front. He watched students chant slogans. They didn't understand. Watched CEOs read statements. They didn't write. Watched journalists repeat headlines. They didn't investigate. Not loyalty. Not conviction. Pressure. Everyone performed certainty. To hide their doubt. And that is the first sign. A nation is losing itself. When truth becomes something you practice in private. He sat at a diner counter one night. Alone. Listening to the hum of neon. And the low murmur of conversations. Carried like secrets. An old man on the next stool spoke without looking up. You ever notice how they stopped debating and started deciding? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The old man nodded slowly. Yeah. You noticed too. A pause. A sip of coffee. They didn't silence the country, he whispered. They just convinced it there was nothing left to say. Truth has a way of arriving quietly. In places where no one is trying to impress a camera. And that night. In a forgotten diner on a forgotten highway. It arrived. He realized the turning wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It was gentle. Comfortable. Inevitable feeling. The most dangerous kind of transformation. The one you only notice after it's complete. Power doesn't always crush rebellion. Sometimes it removes the need for rebellion. By removing the belief in alternatives. And that was the new America. Not defeated. Not conquered. Convinced. A country lulled into believing. The machine finally aligned with their interests. Machines don't align with people. People align with machines. When they're tired enough. And America was tired. Too tired to question. Too tired to resist. Too tired to remember democracy is not a mood. It is a discipline. The veil hadn't been torn away. It had been lowered gently. Like curtains at the end of a show. The audience believed was real. He stood up. Dropped cash on the counter. And stepped into the night air. Cold. Sharp. Honest. For a moment. He closed his eyes. Not in nostalgia. In calculation. The machine was winning. Not because it was strong. But because the people were numb. Awakening wasn't coming through noise. It would come through stillness. Awareness doesn't need a podium. It needs a pulse. And slowly. Quietly. America's pulse was returning. One uneasy whisper at a time. He looked up at the night sky. Stars. Still there. Even when hidden. Truth works the same way. A single breath. A single thought. They think this is the end. It wasn't. It was the moment right before a nation remembers. That silence is not peace. It is the prelude to choosing a side. The curtain hadn't dropped. It had lifted. And that was the moment. The veil began to fall. Hold. Breathe. Feel it. Something unseen had awakened. Not rebellion. Recognition. And recognition, once sparked, cannot be unlit. The storm hadn't arrived yet. But the wind had shifted. And America was beginning to notice. The storm doesn't arrive announcing itself. It doesn't roar like a headline or flash across social feeds. It begins in whispers. In realization. In the tremor that passes through a nation when it finally sees the scaffolding holding up its comforts. He felt it first in the quiet of his own reflection. Not anger. Not frustration. Not revenge. Understanding. A nation lulled into obedience isn't broken, it's waiting. Waiting for someone to remind it what it looks like to be awake. It hit in subtle ways. A friend called, voice hesitant. A journalist texted, tone careful. A teenager paused mid-sentence, question unspoken. The storm was here. Not outside. Not on the streets. Inside every mind unwilling to accept the narrative without question. And he realized, storms can't be fought with shouting. They are weathered, felt, and eventually guided. Because the wind doesn't obey. It follows the path carved for it. And he would carve the first one. He remembered every rally, every speech, every night under glaring lights. Hearing chants that felt both like praise and a warning. The crowds had been loud. The applause had been deafening. But now, absence of sound spoke louder than ever. Silence was thick. It carried weight. It demanded accountability. The people had stopped asking for victory. They were now asking. Who decides what victory means? And the answer wasn't coming from the stage. It was coming from the shadows of observation. Across America, subtle rebellions began forming. Small. Insidious. Invisible to those who celebrated control. Teachers whispered truth to students under fluorescent lights. Workers shared coded messages across digital grids. Communities met quietly in basements, garages, parks, anywhere the eye of the machine wasn't. Freedom doesn't require permission. It requires awareness. And awareness had begun to stir. He moved among the people. Not as a savior. Not as a hero. Not as a headline. A man walking beside a storm no one could see. And yet, the storm felt him. He was its wind, not its lightning. Its pulse, not its strike. He listened. He learned. He guided quietly, without proclamation. Because storms are patient. And patience is lethal. The system believed it was untouchable. It assumed loyalty was bought, fear was enough, control was absolute. But it underestimated one truth. No machine is stronger than the mind that refuses to be lulled. The storm had no schedule. No alarms. No signature. It arrived in moments where courage was tiny but decisive. A clerk who refused to follow orders. A student who refused to accept propaganda. A neighbor who questioned authority. Every small act collected. Every small act fed the gale. The storm didn't scream. It didn't burn buildings. It didn't march in mass. It whispered. It grew. It spread through conscience, through awareness, through questioning. And that whisper was louder than any rhetoric. Because rhetoric divides. Whispers unite. And America, quietly, invisibly, was uniting. He saw it in the eyes of strangers. A flicker of understanding. A nod that meant, I see it too. I feel it too. I won't ignore it. Moments like this cannot be orchestrated. They are organic. Unstoppable. Like lightning waiting in the clouds for the first strike. He spoke less. He acted less. He observed more. Because storms are not led by visibility. They are led by influence. By ideas. By the kind of understanding that cannot be televised or policed. Power feared him less than the awakening he carried. And the awakening was brutal in its simplicity. You cannot buy freedom. You cannot legislate fairness. You can only choose who you will be when everything falls apart. The system had built walls. It had written rules. It had spun narratives. But the storm ignored walls. It bent rules. It shredded narratives. It moved in silence, in reflection, in courage that didn't ask permission. Everywhere he looked, the storm gathered momentum. Not visible. Not flashy. But inevitable. America didn't need him to fight anymore. It needed him to show it what to look for in itself. And that was more dangerous than any rally. More dangerous than any speech. More dangerous than any law. Because the storm wasn't something you could arrest. It wasn't something you could silence. It was alive. And it had finally remembered its voice. The nation began to hum in rhythm with it. Not chaos. Not violence. Not disruption. A quiet, undeniable force. A reckoning that didn't announce itself. But unfolded in every decision, every hesitation, every quiet choice made by ordinary people. And in that stillness, he understood the truth of storms. They don't destroy. They awaken. Somewhere above the city, the sky darkened. Not with weather. Not with smoke. But with potential. The storm had arrived. And it would not be ignored. And then, silence spoke louder. After the storm, there is always a pause. Not a victory. Not a declaration. Not even a sigh. Just the hum of reflection. The quiet after power has been challenged. The stillness after people have remembered that choice is theirs. And always was. He walked alone now. Not out of exile. Not out of defeat. But out of necessity. Because sometimes the clearest perspective comes when no one is watching. The streets were calm. Windows reflected neon and streetlight like mirrors of a city breathing itself. And in the calm, he saw what had been obscured in noise and spectacle. Americans not as consumers of politics. But as human beings capable of understanding truth. Capable of questioning. Capable of awakening. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It is passed down in small acts. A whisper of courage. A refusal to accept convenience over conscience. A conversation held despite fear. It lives in moments most people never notice. The man walking home from work, choosing integrity over expedience. The teacher refusing to simplify reality for comfort. The parent showing their child what it means to be awake. This is the quiet light. Not applause. Not headlines. Not rallies. Light that reminds you that humanity is still here. Even when power forgets it exists. He thought of the days before, when the roar of the crowd had felt like purpose. When chaos felt like validation. When every argument, every fight, every headline, felt like it defined him. And now he understood, it wasn't about the noise. It was about the effect. Not what people shouted, but what they carried with them afterward. Awakening isn't televised. It isn't celebrated. It is subtle, quiet, insistent. And it spreads in ways that the powerful cannot control. In homes across America, people were talking again. Not about parties, not about polls, not about popularity. About truth. About questions they hadn't asked in years. About promises that had been spoken but not delivered. About what it really means to live in a country built on the idea of choice. They paused. They listened. They reflected. And in that pause, light returned. He looked at the city skyline, now bathed in quiet moonlight. Each tower reflected a story of human ambition, failure, resilience. The lights reminded him of individual sparks. Small, singular, fragile, yet able to illuminate an entire night. A city survives not on laws alone, but on people remembering what it means to care, to question, to act. And even if the storms return, and they will, these sparks endure. Silent, unseen, undeniable. He thought of the future. Not a scripted political path. Not a predetermined outcome. But something more human. A nation capable of remembering itself. Capable of choosing. Capable of standing, even when no one is watching. So when your moment comes, he realized. What will you stand for? Because light is not passive. It requires choice. It requires courage. It requires persistence. And every individual decides, silently, whether to carry it forward. If this story made you think, share it. Because truth survives only when it is told. Not whispered into microphones. Not printed on pages. Not staged for applause. But lived. Passed from one decision to the next. From one person awake to another. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. Power is subtle. Not always violent. Not always loud. Sometimes, it waits patiently in the background. In the spaces you don't notice. In the rules you take for granted. In the applause you never question. He had learned this early. Not through victories. Not through losses. But through watching the mechanisms of influence operate. While the nation slept. Control doesn't need chaos to succeed. It needs compliance. And compliance, when it arrives willingly, is more dangerous than rebellion. He walked through corridors of influence again. Offices, think tanks, private clubs. Faces greeted him politely. Eyes polite, careful. Words measured like water in a glass. Everyone knew the history. Everyone knew the narrative. And yet, in this calm, he could see the cracks. Not in them. Not even in the system. But in the way the system assumed it would always work. The question was no longer, who rules? It was, who decides what ruling looks like? And that question, once asked, cannot be ignored. He watched the headlines. Same faces. Same stories. Same promises of stability. But beneath the surface, something deeper churned. The subtle redirection of attention. The gentle suggestion that debate is outdated. That disagreement is dangerous. That certainty is safety. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The machine didn't fail the people. It was built this way. And the people, tired, distracted, lulled, didn't notice. In conversations, he asked the same question again and again. Not to provoke. Not to argue. But to see if anyone would pause long enough to hear it. Do we control the system, or does it control us? Sometimes, they laughed. Sometimes, they nodded. Sometimes, they walked away. But seeds planted quietly. In shadows. In curiosity. Grow faster than those sown in noise. Because revelation doesn't need an audience. It only needs a mind awake enough to notice it. He remembered the early days of his rise. The rallies, the chaos, the headlines that shook the world. Then he remembered the calm mornings afterward. The city celebrating, the media smiling, the system patting itself on the back. And he understood the cruel truth. The machine never feared the storm he could create. It feared the storm the nation could create. Once it realized the storm was not a single man, it was a system awakened. The turning point wasn't a loss of power. It was awareness. And that awareness, once seated, spreads. He moved through neighborhoods, unobserved. People smiled politely. Children waved absent-mindedly. Old men in diners nodded slightly. All carrying quiet questions. All wondering what had shifted. Not loud enough for headlines. Not dramatic enough for news cycles. But enough to feel different. Because awareness is like wind. It cannot be contained. It can only be redirected. And the first gusts had begun. Every system fears three things. 1. Chaos. 2. Rebellion. 3. Understanding. It can survive the first two. It can tolerate the second if it is loud and disorganized. But understanding is fatal. Because once people see how the gears turn. Once they recognize the illusion of choice. Once they realize obedience was never requested. Obedience ends. And America, quietly, had begun to see. That night, he looked at the city lights stretching into the horizon. Neon and street lamps reflecting the heartbeat of a nation. Fragile, flickering, yet persistent. He whispered to himself. We are awake. We can see. We remember. And in the quiet of that acknowledgement, he felt it, the first real wind of the storm to come. Not violent. Not angry. Not loud. Awakening. And sometimes, the most profound power is not seized, it is realized. They called it progress. They called it stability. They called it order. He called it something else entirely, a carefully orchestrated illusion. From the outside, everything appeared seamless. News cycles aligned. Corporations nodded in unison. Politicians smiled for the cameras. The nation believed it was moving forward, together, inevitably, safely. But what looked like freedom was dependency. What looked like choice was control. What looked like safety was confinement. The machine had perfected the art of appearing benevolent. He moved through corridors few people saw. Rooms without cameras. Offices without press. Where decisions weren't announced, they were made. Where consensus wasn't debated, it was dictated. And suddenly, the patterns were clear. Not in speeches. Not in votes. Not even in legislation. The system didn't fail the people. It had been designed this way. Efficiency over transparency. Polish over honesty. Comfort over conscience. And the most shocking part? No one noticed. Not because they were blind. But because they were too busy believing the illusion. He saw the mechanics of influence. Campaigns scripted for emotional resonance. Media narratives crafted to soothe dissent. Corporate messaging aligned to reinforce compliance. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't corruption. It was architecture. A structure built to survive scrutiny. To withstand protest. To persist long after headlines faded. And the people, exhausted from fighting, welcomed it. Clapped for it. Lived in it. Because it felt familiar. Safe. Like home. But safety is not freedom. Familiarity is not truth. Comfort is not independence. He watched as the narrative unfolded on screens and stages. Anchors repeated talking points as if rehearsed by the same hand. Influencers echoed approved sentiments without question. Even institutions he trusted seemed complicit in maintaining the facade. And there it was, the key revelation. The system's survival did not depend on convincing the people. It depended on convincing them to stop questioning. Once curiosity faded, compliance became automatic. Once independence was invisible, loyalty was irrelevant. Once awareness was silenced, power was absolute. But revelation is a dangerous thing. Because awareness cannot be contained. Once a few see the gears. Once a few understand the machinery. They begin to notice inconsistencies. They question outcomes. They track motives. They watch what is hidden. And then, just as subtly as control was imposed, truth begins to ripple outward. He spoke quietly to those who would listen. Not with speeches. Not with social media posts. Not with rallies. With insight. With clarity. With the subtle, almost imperceptible act of pointing out patterns. And those who listened began to remember. Remember that authority is not infallible. Remember that comfort can mask control. Remember that safety is no substitute for sovereignty. The first truths were spreading. Not fast. Not loud. But relentless. The system noticed. Not openly, not with rage. But with calculation. It didn't need to strike. It needed to distract. To pacify. To make questioning appear irrational. But the truth had already left the room. It had already entered the minds of those willing to see. And once truth moves, it cannot be contained. Outside, the streets continued their quiet rhythm. Children played. Cars hummed along empty avenues. Lights flickered in apartment windows. Everything looked normal. Everything looked calm. And that was the brilliance of the illusion. Normalcy hides revelation. But beneath it, the storm gathered. Awareness, once sparked, cannot be erased. It spreads in whispers, in gestures, in choices people make when no one is watching. And sometimes, the most powerful revolutions begin. Not with noise. But with understanding. He looked at the city skyline, each tower reflecting lights like mirrors. Each window a story, a life, a question yet to be asked. And he knew the truth. The machine could survive for a time. But it could never survive awakening. Because awakening doesn't yell. It doesn't need armies. It simply grows, relentlessly, inevitably, quietly. Until the world itself must acknowledge it. The veil had lifted. The smoke had cleared. And America, finally, could see what had always been there. The most dangerous things in the world are often invisible. Not shadows. Not storms. Not enemies you can name. They are the forces that shape thought. That guide decisions. That decide which voices will echo. And which will be forgotten. He had walked among them. He had watched them quietly orchestrate the world. While people applauded the illusion. And now he understood. The fight was never for the loud. It was for the unseen. Boards of directors. Political committees. Lobbyists in suits moving like shadows. Analysts predicting trends that never existed. All dancing to a rhythm dictated by profit, influence, and survival. It wasn't malicious. Not entirely. It was systemic. Self-preserving. Efficient. Efficiency isn't evil. It's immoral. And the nation, exhausted and distracted, was already complicit. Because the greatest oppression is not chains or bars. It is subtle. It is structure. It is the illusion that someone else is deciding for your own good. He met quietly with thinkers, journalists, and ordinary Americans. Not to instruct. Not to demand allegiance. But to reveal. To illuminate the hidden gears. Some nodded in disbelief. Some asked, nervously. Are you sure? And he answered simply. Yes. The truth is always this quiet until you choose to see it. Awareness, once kindled, cannot be unlearned. It moves like wind through a city. Invisible but unstoppable. The system noticed. Not with violence. Not yet. It responded with subtle adjustments. Stories shifted slightly. Narratives reworded. Opinion leaders repeated comforting platitudes. Discomfort was minimized. Compliance was pacified. It was clever. It was patient. It was designed to endure. But there is a problem with invisible control. The people it manipulates rarely remain passive forever. He walked the streets, watching the ordinary awaken. Not in waves of protest. Not in fiery confrontations. But in quiet realization. A teacher spoke differently in class. A neighbor questioned assumptions at the dinner table. A clerk refused to follow instructions blindly. A student researched beyond the curriculum. These small acts, seemingly insignificant, were seismic in their potential. Awakening does not always shout. It whispers, and grows louder with every echo. Power, he realized, does not fear the visible threat. It fears the uncontainable awareness that spreads beneath the surface. It fears minds that question silently. Then act deliberately. And that is exactly what was happening. America's quiet reckoning was beginning. Not chaotic. Not destructive. Not immediate. But inevitable. In a diner late at night, a man told him quietly. They think everyone is too tired to care. But they forget that even the tired can recognize manipulation. He nodded. Because he had seen it before. Small sparks ignite when the air is still. When the sun sets on the illusion. And people finally look at what they've accepted for so long. The unseen forces may shape the world. They may guide decisions. They may craft narratives. But they cannot stop human recognition. It cannot be caged. It cannot be ignored. A city skyline stretched into darkness. Every lit window a possibility. Every shadow a question. Every human inside a potential witness. And the storm, though invisible, had begun to gather. Not in destruction. Not in chaos. Not in anger. In awareness. The first fractures were quiet. Almost imperceptible. Like cracks in a window you only notice when sunlight hits at the right angle. They appeared in conversations. In boardrooms. In classrooms. In living rooms. People began pausing before repeating headlines. Before believing promises. Before nodding along. A simple question started to echo. Who is shaping this reality, and why? And once that question exists, control begins to slip. It wasn't chaos. Not yet. It was hesitation. A clerk lingered over instructions. A journalist fact-checked, even when discouraged. A teacher framed a lesson differently, nudging students to think, not memorize. Tiny decisions. Small deviations. But together, they formed a quiet fracture in the machinery of obedience. He walked through a city where everything seemed normal. Neon lights hummed overhead. Cars glided along smooth asphalt. Billboards flickered with promises of prosperity. But beneath it, he could feel the tremor. A collective pause in the rhythm of unquestioning compliance. The system's pulse faltered. It noticed, subtly. Like a predator sensing movement in the grass. The powerful responded, predictably. Not with force. Not with speeches. They adjusted. They redirected. They whispered narratives to soothe discomfort. They praised loyalty. They reframed dissent. Efficiency doesn't break. It evolves. But evolution takes time. And fractures, once formed, cannot easily be erased. In a diner late at night, he overheard a conversation. They think we'll just follow along. But we're starting to see through it. See through what? The script. The manipulation. The quiet assumption that we don't matter. A pause. Sips of coffee. Eyes meeting across the table. Recognition. The first fracture was not violent. It was cognitive. It was moral. It was a choice to refuse unconscious obedience. The system had built stability on certainty. But certainty depends on trust. And trust depends on transparency. Once transparency becomes optional, certainty is an illusion. And the nation begins to sense it. Even if the majority cannot yet name it. He watched as subtle acts of courage multiplied. A neighbor refuses a convenient lie. A worker questions a policy publicly. A student challenges an assignment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing televised. But the pattern was emerging. Cracks spread quietly. Awareness became contagious. And the system, designed for control, struggled to adapt. He remembered what his own mentors had told him. Power fears chaos. Power fears rebellion. Power fears awareness most of all. And in this quiet moment, the truth crystallized. The nation was awakening. Not in rallies. Not in headlines. Not in riots. In realization. And realization cannot be silenced. The first fractures, subtle though they were, became impossible to ignore. People began to question everything. Not just leaders. Not just narratives. But themselves. Because awakening begins in the soul. Before it manifests in the street. Before it appears on screens. Before it reaches consensus. And that awakening, slow, deliberate, unrelenting, was the most dangerous thing of all. The cracks became visible. Not in riots. Not in chaos. Not in headlines designed to shock. They appeared in gestures, in decisions, in whispers too faint for cameras. A teacher refusing to teach propaganda. A clerk asking inconvenient questions. A neighbor challenging the narrative at a barbecue. A student researching beyond the curriculum. These small acts were the first signs. That awareness could no longer be contained. He watched carefully, blending into the crowd. Not to lead. Not to provoke. But to observe. Every pause in conversation. Every hesitation before agreeing. Every silent nod of doubt. They were the tremors before the quake. Because the machine, as efficient and polished as it was, could not predict thought. It could not script intuition. It could not anticipate the human desire to question. And that, he realized, was the weakest point in every system. The individual mind that refuses to yield. In cafes, diners, classrooms, and offices, small acts multiplied. People began speaking in code at first. Questions asked indirectly. Comments framed carefully. Ideas tested in whispers. Not loud. Not aggressive. But persistent. The first signs are always subtle. Invisible to the indifferent. Alarming only to those who believed control was absolute. The system noticed. Not in panic. Not with force. But with adjustment. Scripts were rewritten. Slogans reframed. Loyalty praised, dissent subtly discouraged. Control is a living thing. It evolves. It adapts. It waits. But awareness has no expiration date. And once a mind wakes, it begins to awaken others. He moved through the city like a shadow. People noticed him, sometimes. Sometimes not. They whispered to him, shared what they dared not broadcast. It feels different now. They're hiding things in plain sight. Even the news doesn't tell the truth anymore. And he nodded, silently. Because the truth was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone willing to see. The first signs were multiplying. And they could not be stopped. Outside, the skyline glowed in neon and moonlight. Windows reflected ordinary lives, each one a story, a decision, a potential spark. The storm had not yet arrived in full force. But the wind was shifting. The air was charged with anticipation. The first signs always come before understanding. And understanding, once it takes root, cannot be ignored. He thought back to the quiet mornings of exile. Watching a nation lulled into complacency. He had waited for this. Not to return. Not to reclaim. But to witness. And to guide the spark when it appeared. Because the first signs are fragile. They must be nurtured. Observed. Protected. The storm would follow. It always does. But first comes recognition. First comes awareness. First come the signs. And America was beginning to see. Awakening rarely announces itself. It doesn't roll like thunder. It doesn't burn like fire. It begins in ripples. Small. Almost imperceptible. And yet, unstoppable once set in motion. A student questioned a lecture. A neighbor refused to accept a convenient lie. A clerk spoke truth quietly in the break room. A mother debated the narrative with her children. Alone, these moments seemed insignificant. Together, they became a current. A subtle, relentless flow that the machine could neither contain nor predict. He watched it spread. Across neighborhoods, towns, and cities. Not in headlines. Not in rallies. Not in viral videos. In coffee shops, backyards, classrooms. In moments when no one else was watching. In conversations paused, reconsidered, reframed. The ripple had begun. The storm was still silent. But the water was moving. The system noticed, of course. It doesn't ignore change. But it misjudged it. Assuming awareness could be smoothed over. Believing loyalty could be engineered. Mistaking silence for compliance. They didn't see that ripples gather strength. Combining, colliding, forming waves invisible until they crash. And he knew that wave was forming now. In a small diner on the edge of the city, an old man whispered. They think this is nothing. But I've felt it. Something's moving. The waitress nodded. Quietly. Her hands trembling as she poured coffee. Recognition doesn't need permission. It doesn't need applause. It needs acknowledgement. And once acknowledged, it multiplies. He walked the streets at night. The city was calm. The hum of neon lights reflected in puddles. The wind moved through alleys. And in the shadows, he could sense it, the current of thought awakening. People talking quietly. Neighbors sharing observations. Friends hesitating before repeating propaganda. The system was designed to ignore these things. To categorize them as harmless. To dismiss them as coincidence. But ripples become waves. And waves reshape everything in their path. He remembered every subtle act that had led here. A teacher defying instructions. A journalist questioning sources. A parent challenging assumptions. A stranger refusing to follow blindly. Individually, these were small sparks. Together, they formed a current strong enough to erode the illusion. The storm hadn't arrived yet. But the tide was rising. And tides cannot be held back by walls, gates, or screens. He paused at a bridge, looking over the river that cut through the city. Reflections of light shimmered on the water's surface. Each flicker a reminder, small things matter. Ripples, when joined, grow into movement. Awareness, when shared, becomes unstoppable. And he knew the wave would come. Not violent. Not chaotic. Not loud. Relentless. Quiet. Inevitable. The ripple had started. And with it, the storm was born. The machine sensed it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But it felt the shift. The subtle hesitation in conversations. The pause before repeating headlines. The flicker of doubt in eyes that once reflected certainty. Control is never passive. It reacts. It adapts. It calculates. And now, it was calculating faster than ever. He moved through the city streets, unnoticed. Watching the first signs of friction between people and the system. A teacher quietly revising a lesson plan. A journalist hesitating to quote sources without question. A neighbor refusing to comply with a community narrative. Small acts, almost invisible. Yet they were enough to disturb the machinery. Because control isn't broken by chaos. It is broken by awareness. The first confrontations arrived quietly. Not as protests. Not as headlines. But as hesitation in the workplace. Questions in meetings. Debates at kitchen tables. It was subtle. Almost polite. But it rattled the system. For the first time, people were asking. Do we obey, or do we think? And once that question arises, nothing is ever the same. He watched one interaction that summed it up. A corporate executive gave instructions. A junior employee paused, carefully. Should we question this? The room fell silent. Eyes darted. Breaths held. No one had ever dared speak like this before. And in that silence, he recognized the truth. The edge of control is always fragile. All it takes is one mind refusing to follow blindly. And the illusion begins to crumble. The system responded. Not violently. Not openly. It adapted. It offered incentives. It reframed choices. It whispered assurances. Control is clever. But not infinite. It cannot anticipate every spark. Every hesitation. Every moment when an individual chooses to see clearly. And sparks were multiplying faster than it could calculate. He walked past the city hall, lights reflecting in rain-slicked streets. Politicians smiled for the cameras. Believing the system still obedient. But the cracks had already appeared. In offices. In schools. In homes. In minds. The machine's control was an elegant illusion. And illusions, no matter how polished, shatter in daylight. He remembered a lesson from the old days. Power fears chaos, rebellion, and awareness. Of the three, awareness is the most dangerous. Because it cannot be silenced. And now, the truth was undeniable. People were waking. And the first confrontations were no longer theoretical. The machine had met its first challenge. Not force. Not rhetoric. But minds refusing to yield. The storm had not yet arrived. It would not be violent. It would not roar. But it had begun. Quietly. Relentlessly. Inevitably. And the edge of control, once absolute, was cracking. Awakening is never sudden. It doesn't announce itself with sirens or headlines. It begins quietly, inside one mind, then another, then another. Like a whisper carried on the wind. He saw it everywhere now. In classrooms, where students hesitated to parrot convenience. In offices, where workers paused before accepting instructions. In neighborhoods, where neighbors asked uncomfortable questions. These were small acts. Ordinary acts. Yet together, they formed a rhythm the system could not ignore. A young teacher stayed late, rewriting a lesson plan. Not to defy anyone. Not to make a statement. But to give truth a chance to breathe. A clerk refused to process a request that felt unjust. Not in protest. Not in anger. But because conscience demanded it. A mother argued with her children not to accept the narrative blindly. Not with lectures. Not with fear. But with questions that forced thinking. Each spark was fragile. But sparks, when shared, ignite. He walked through the city at night. Neon lights reflected in puddles. Rain whispered across asphalt. And everywhere, he could feel it, the pulse of realization. Not loud. Not immediate. Not violent. But alive. Persistent. Growing. The storm had begun, not in chaos, but in awareness. The system noticed. Of course it did. Adjustments were made. Smiles became more polished. Slogans reframed. Obedience subtly rewarded. But it had misjudged the spark. Awakening cannot be bribed. It cannot be threatened. It cannot be ignored once it reaches enough minds. And the spark was spreading faster than the system could calculate. In a quiet diner, an old man whispered to him. They don't understand. It's not about rallies. It's not about protests. It's about people thinking for themselves. Once they see it, they can't unsee it. The waitress nodded. A student at the counter paused mid-bite. Even the janitor looked up from sweeping. Recognition. Awareness. The first tremors of change. The storm wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. It was a tide rising in the minds of people. A quiet insistence that the world could be seen clearly. And that obedience was optional. He thought of every small act he had witnessed. The teacher, the clerk, the mother, the student. And he understood. This is how revolutions start. Not in fire and chaos. But in reflection and choice. He paused at the city bridge. Water flowed beneath him, steady, relentless. Each ripple a reminder. Small actions, joined, create unstoppable currents. The awakening had begun. And the current was building. The storm would come. But it would not be controlled. It would not be scripted. It would be human. And in that humanity lay its power. The ripple had become a wave. It was still quiet. Still subtle. Still mostly unseen. But it was moving. For the first time, the system felt it, not as speculation. Not as a minor inconvenience. But as a real, tangible challenge. Small acts of defiance were no longer isolated. They began to intersect. To connect. To form patterns the machine could not ignore. In a corporate office, a mid-level manager refused a directive that felt wrong. The decision was small, bureaucratic, almost meaningless on the surface. But it set off a chain reaction. Colleagues whispered, debated, and eventually joined him. A classroom teacher shared hidden truths with students. Assignments were reframed. Discussions shifted. Critical thinking quietly returned. A journalist, once fearful, began asking questions she had long avoided. Her words were measured. Careful. Precise. And the system noticed. The first confrontation did not arrive with headlines or anger. It arrived in hesitation. In polite resistance. In the refusal to comply blindly. A simple question echoed through boardrooms, classrooms, and neighborhoods. Do we follow, or do we think? Once asked, that question cannot be ignored. It spreads. It grows. It awakens. He observed quietly, blending in, listening. Not to lead. Not to command. But to witness. Every subtle act mattered. Every whispered question mattered. Every refusal, no matter how small, mattered. Because control is strongest when unquestioned. And once questioning begins, even quietly, power trembles. The system responded cautiously. Adjusting narratives. Rewarding compliance. redirecting attention. But it underestimated something. The human mind does not operate like a machine. It cannot be fully predicted, fully contained, fully silenced. And the wave, composed of thousands of tiny, individual acts, was moving faster than the machine could counter. He walked past the city's government buildings at night. Lights reflected in puddles. A soft wind carried the hum of distant traffic. And he realized the truth. The first challenge was never meant to topple power immediately. It was meant to awaken thought. To force reflection. To fracture obedience. And fractures, once formed, cannot be smoothed over. The first challenge was subtle. Invisible to most. And yet undeniable. It would grow. It would spread. It would insist on being recognized. The storm was forming. And the system, for the first time, knew it could not control the outcome. Ripples became currents. Currents became tides. The awakening was no longer a quiet whisper, it was moving through the veins of the nation. Ordinary acts of courage began to intersect, forming a network of awareness that the system could not see, much less control. A student challenged the approved curriculum. A clerk refused an unethical order. A mother debated the official narrative with her children. A journalist asked a question no one dared to print. Each was small. Individually, almost invisible. Together, unstoppable. He observed from the edges. Not to direct. Not to command. But to understand. The tide was rising not because of speeches or rallies. But because people were remembering something they had long forgotten. That truth belongs to no one. Yet it belongs to all. And once people remember that, obedience becomes optional. The system noticed the subtle unrest. It reacted with adjustments, not force. Polished messaging. Rewritten narratives. Praise for compliance. Quiet pressure against deviation. But it misjudged the tide. Awareness cannot be bribed. It cannot be threatened. It cannot be silenced. And it spreads faster than propaganda. In a small neighborhood diner, an old man whispered. They think control lasts forever. But the human mind is patient. And it remembers. A waitress nodded, silently. A student at the counter paused mid-bite. Even the janitor looked up from his broom. Recognition. Understanding. Awareness. The tide was forming, and no one could stop it. He remembered every quiet act that had led here. The teacher, the clerk, the mother, the student. Tiny sparks, each one alone fragile. But together forming a current strong enough to reshape the world. The storm had not yet arrived. The tide had not yet broken. But the momentum was undeniable. He walked along the river at night. Reflections of city lights shimmered on the water. Each ripple reminded him, small actions, joined, create movement. Awareness had become collective. And the system, for all its efficiency, could only watch. The tide rises silently. Relentlessly. Inevitably. The awakening was no longer theoretical. It had become visible in choices, in hesitation, in courage. And in that rising tide, he saw the first hint of the impossible. A nation beginning to reclaim its own agency. The storm was coming. And the tide would carry it. The tide had risen. The currents of awareness were no longer isolated. They were touching each other, merging, colliding. Small acts of courage became networks of defiance. A group of teachers coordinated lessons that encouraged critical thinking. Clerks across departments quietly refused unethical instructions. Journalists shared facts carefully, avoiding the spin that once paralyzed them. Neighbors whispered truths to each other, planting seeds of doubt and reflection. Individually, these actions seemed inconsequential. Collectively, they were dangerous. He walked through the city at night, observing quietly. Every small gesture mattered. Every refusal mattered. Every question mattered. The system, for all its design and polish, had never accounted for one fundamental truth. Human beings cannot be entirely controlled once they choose to see. In a quiet office, a mid-level manager whispered to his team. "Let's do what's right, not what's expected." The words hung in the air like sparks ready to ignite. One by one, colleagues nodded. One by one, they began to act differently. Not violently. Not loudly. But decisively. The ripple had reached a critical mass. Across the city, similar acts of defiance appeared. A student challenged the narrative in a classroom discussion. A small newsroom published a story the system wanted buried. A neighbor refused to repeat propaganda at a community meeting. Each act was tiny. Yet each was a thread unraveling the illusion of control. The system responded with subtle measures. Encouragement here. Pressure there. Polished messages, subtle reminders of authority. It was adaptive. It was clever. But it was too late. Awareness cannot be unlearned. Curiosity cannot be silenced. Questioning cannot be caged. The sparks of defiance were now visible. And visible sparks are contagious. He paused on a quiet street, listening to fragments of conversations. They can't control us if we think for ourselves. Maybe they were wrong about what people will accept. Something is changing. I can feel it. Recognition. Reflection. Defiance. These were the first murmurs of a new order. Not imposed by power. But emerging organically from people awake. The storm was still coming. But it was no longer invisible. The tide of awakening had turned into a current of defiance. And in that current, the impossible became possible. People remembered that they had agency. People remembered that obedience is optional. People began to act, together, quietly, deliberately. The machine could only watch. And watch it did. The first cracks were subtle. Barely noticeable. But they existed. A clerk refused a directive quietly. A teacher allowed a discussion that questioned authority. A journalist published an inconvenient fact. A parent challenged the official story in front of their child. Individually, these acts were inconsequential. Together, they formed patterns the system could no longer ignore. The machine had relied on certainty, on obedience, on predictability. But cracks are unpredictable. And they spread faster than control can respond. He moved through government halls and corporate offices. Polite smiles. Measured words. But behind them, unease. The first signs of disruption were spreading. Emails went unanswered. Decisions were questioned. Orders were delayed. It wasn't rebellion. Not yet. It was hesitation. Doubt. Recognition. In a classroom, a teacher defied the approved curriculum subtly. Allowing students to ask questions that were never supposed to be asked. The principal noticed. Did nothing. Could do nothing. Because once thought spreads, authority cannot fully contain it. The system attempted minor adjustments. Reassurance here. Incentive there. Subtle pressure. But the cracks were already undermining certainty. Control relies on unquestioned compliance. When compliance falters, even slightly, the structure begins to wobble. And people were beginning to falter. He listened to conversations across the city. They're hiding something. I can feel it. Why didn't anyone question this before? Maybe it's not just me thinking differently. Recognition, realization, reflection. The cracks were no longer invisible. They had moved from whispers to acknowledgement. And acknowledgement spreads faster than any order. He walked through a government building late at night. Empty offices. Flickering fluorescent lights. A reminder of how fragile control really was. Authority depends on perception. On fear. On habit. Remove any of those. And the structure begins to tremble. The cracks weren't violent. Not dramatic. But relentless. Subtle. Unstoppable. Outside, the city slept. But beneath the calm, the fractures were forming. A teacher refusing to comply fully. A clerk questioning directives. A journalist seeking truth. A parent raising critical children. The first cracks in the system were no longer isolated. They were a network. Invisible to most. But undeniable to those who watched carefully. And once a network forms, the tide of awakening cannot be stopped. The cracks had widened. The ripples had joined. And now, the first signs of coordinated resistance began to appear. Not in protests. Not in riots. Not in viral campaigns. It started in quiet collaboration. Teachers exchanging lesson plans to encourage critical thinking. Clerks comparing instructions and refusing unethical orders together. Journalists sharing facts cautiously, forming a network of verification. Neighbors whispering, questioning, connecting. It was subtle. It was invisible to cameras. It was unstoppable. He watched as these networks formed. Not with a manifesto. Not with leadership. But with the simple act of alignment. People who refused to obey blindly. Finding each other in silence. In cafes, backyards, classrooms, offices. A wave was forming. Not loud. Not violent. But deliberate. And the system felt it. The system responded cautiously. Polished narratives. Subtle pressures. Encouragement for compliance. Distraction where it could. But resistance, once coordinated, cannot be fully redirected. It grows. It spreads. It inspires more than obedience ever could. He walked past city offices late at night. Lights reflected in puddles. Empty hallways hummed with quiet tension. In that silence, he felt the significance. The first small, coordinated acts of resistance are the most dangerous. Because they cannot be labeled or controlled. They are human. They are intentional. They are invisible until too many participate. Across neighborhoods, whispers became conversations. Questions became debates. Choices became actions. People began to notice one another. To see that defiance was possible. That obedience was optional. That systems are powerful only as long as they are unchallenged. And now they were being challenged. In a diner, an old man leaned toward him. They think they're untouchable. But coordination doesn't need armies. It needs clarity, courage, and connection. The waitress nodded, quietly. Even the young student at the counter understood. Because networks of quiet resistance, though invisible, cannot be ignored. He looked over the city skyline. Lights reflected in glass towers. Windows glimmered with ordinary lives. Inside, ordinary people were beginning to resist. Not loudly. Not violently. Not dramatically. But effectively. And that is when the machine begins to falter. Not from what it sees. But from what it cannot anticipate. The quiet resistance had begun. Invisible, patient, and deliberate. And the system, polished, confident, unyielding, had never faced anything like it. The tide was rising. And with it, the impossible became inevitable. People were beginning to reclaim their own agency. The tide had risen. The current of quiet resistance now reached institutions. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. But the strain was undeniable. Policies that once passed unquestioned were delayed. Meetings that once ran smoothly ended in hesitation. Decisions that once required blind compliance were now debated, challenged, refused. The system had never been tested like this. Not by protests. Not by riots. Not by headlines. But by something more dangerous. Thought. He watched from the edges as the first signs appeared in public spaces. A city council meeting where council members questioned every assertion. A press conference where journalists asked inconvenient questions. A school board where teachers refused to parrot pre-approved narratives. The strain was subtle. But visible. And it unnerved the system. Because control is strongest when unquestioned. When hesitation spreads, the illusion of certainty begins to crumble. The machine responded. Subtle adjustments first. Polished speeches. Media narratives reframed. Promotions for compliance, gentle reminders for dissenters. But the cracks could not be hidden anymore. Awareness had multiplied. And the people, once passive, now paused before accepting what they were told. The strain was showing. Not in chaos. Not in dramatic headlines. But in hesitation, in questioning, in thought. In a quiet cafe, he overheard two neighbors. They're struggling to maintain control. Can you feel it? The hesitation. People are starting to see through the script. Recognition. Reflection. Understanding. And once recognition spreads, control becomes an illusion. He walked the streets late at night. Neon lights flickered, reflecting off wet asphalt. Windows glimmered with ordinary lives. Each a potential spark. The strain was no longer theoretical. It had become reality. The system could no longer rely on unquestioning compliance. Every decision, every directive, every expectation was now at risk. The tide of quiet resistance had reached the surface. And with it came the first public acknowledgement of systemic strain. Not in admission. Not in apology. Not in capitulation. But in hesitation. In pause. In the subtle tremor of uncertainty that even the powerful cannot ignore. He looked at the skyline and understood. The first cracks had become fractures. The tide of awakening had transformed into movement. And the system, polished and perfect as it seemed, could no longer pretend it was unshakable. The storm was still coming. But now, everyone could feel the wind. The storm had arrived. Not with fire or chaos. Not with sirens or headlines. But with awareness, deliberate, unstoppable, and undeniable. The tide of awakening collided with the machine. Not violently. Not dramatically. But effectively. Every small act of defiance, every refusal, every whispered question now formed a wall the system could no longer ignore. He moved through the city, watching the first visible consequences. Meetings dragged on endlessly, decisions stalled. Employees hesitated before following instructions. Teachers challenged curriculum openly, expecting pushback, and receiving none. Journalists published questions once too dangerous to ask. The system, confident and polished, was faltering. Its control was not gone. But the illusion of certainty had shattered. In a city council chamber, a debate erupted. Not shouting. Not chaos. Just deliberate refusal to accept narrative as fact. The tension was palpable. The system had never faced such coordinated clarity. For decades, it had relied on passive compliance. But the people had remembered something. Obedience is optional. And once optional, it cannot be enforced. Across the city, small acts collided. Neighbors refused directives, citing principle. Clerks collectively challenged procedures. Students demanded transparency. Parents insisted on discussion, not indoctrination. The network of quiet resistance became a web. The current was visible now. And the machine could no longer pretend it was still in control. He thought of every spark, every ripple, every quiet act that had led here. The teacher staying late to rewrite a lesson. The journalist asking questions no one dared to ask. The mother challenging the official narrative. The clerk refusing an unethical order. Individually, minor. Collectively, unstoppable. The storm wasn't a single moment. It was a collision of countless small decisions. A reminder that the greatest power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, persists, and multiplies until it cannot be ignored. And now, the collision was unmistakable. The system tried to adapt. Subtle coercion. Polished messaging. Threats disguised as incentives. But awareness is immune to manipulation. Curiosity cannot be bribed. Recognition cannot be silenced. The collision had begun. And everyone involved, silent or seen, powerful or ordinary, felt it. He looked over the city skyline. Lights flickered across buildings like mirrors. Windows glimmered with ordinary lives, each one a node of awareness. The collision was not violent. It was unstoppable. And in that collision, the impossible became inevitable. People remembered their agency. And the machine had to reckon with it. The collision sparked something larger. It was no longer whispers. No longer hesitant gestures. The quiet resistance had become visible. Coordinated. Deliberate. Relentless. In classrooms, students questioned openly. In offices, employees challenged unethical instructions. In neighborhoods, neighbors shared truths previously hidden. In newsrooms, journalists reported facts without apology. And the system, polished and confident as it seemed, floundered. Its mechanisms of control strained under the weight of awareness. He watched it unfold from the edges, not to lead, but to witness. The first major responses were subtle. Not violent. Not dramatic. Polished speeches. Carefully written memos. Incentives for compliance. Encouragement here. Gentle reminders there. But each response revealed a truth. The machine was not omnipotent. It had underestimated the power of human thought. Across the city, the resistance spread like wildfire in hidden channels. Teachers coordinated lessons that encouraged independent thinking. Clerks refused to follow instructions blindly, finding solidarity in quiet networks. Journalists asked questions that previously would have ended careers. Parents raised children to think critically, not obey automatically. These acts were ordinary. Yet, combined, they became extraordinary. A movement not organized by leadership, but by human conscience. He recalled the first sparks that led here. The teacher staying late to rewrite lessons. The journalist quietly asking questions. The mother teaching children to question. The clerk refusing a minor order. Individually insignificant. Together, transformative. The tide of human awareness had grown into a current strong enough to challenge the system itself. The machine responded again. More pressure. More incentives. Polished messages, repeated endlessly. Attempts to redirect attention. But resistance cannot be bribed or silenced. Awareness grows, spreads, and multiplies. And the system, for all its design, could no longer contain it. In the quiet of night, he observed ordinary citizens, unaware of how pivotal they were. A student debating a topic in a library. A clerk questioning a procedure in a private office. A parent discussing current events with their child. Neighbors quietly organizing information. These small, deliberate actions created ripples. And ripples, once connected, form waves. Waves that cannot be stopped. The storm was not violent. It was deliberate. It was patient. And now, unstoppable. The first major systemic responses had failed to suppress it. Awareness had escaped containment. Recognition could not be erased. And in that failure, a new reality emerged. People remembered their agency. And the machine had no choice but to reckon with it. The tide had risen. The collision had happened. And now, the balance was shifting. The system, polished and precise, still functioned. But it was no longer in complete control. Every decision, every instruction, every narrative faced scrutiny. The illusion of certainty had crumbled. And with that, the power dynamics began to tilt. He watched quietly as ordinary acts multiplied into collective awareness. Teachers allowed questions once forbidden. Students challenged authority with evidence and reasoning. Clerks refused unethical orders openly. Journalists investigated truth with renewed courage. These small acts, once isolated, had converged into a network. A network the system could not suppress. A network that, for the first time, dictated terms, not the machine. The first public acknowledgement of strain was subtle. Polished speeches, careful messaging, incentives for compliance. Yet, the cracks had grown into fractures, and fractures are hard to mend. People began to sense it. Authority was no longer absolute. Compliance was no longer guaranteed. The narrative could no longer dictate reality. And with that understanding came courage. He moved through the city streets, observing the quiet revolution in action. Neighbors sharing information cautiously but confidently. Parents teaching children to question. Colleagues correcting one another when misinformation slipped through. Journalists refusing censorship and spinning narratives. The balance was no longer weighted in favor of control. It was a tug of war, and awareness was gaining ground. He remembered the first sparks that led to this point. The teacher staying late. The journalist asking questions. The mother refusing blind obedience. The clerk refusing minor orders. Small acts of courage had multiplied into an unstoppable current. And now, the current was reshaping the landscape. The system tried, of course. Polished narratives. Gentle pressure. Rewards for compliance. It adapted, but adaptation cannot fully suppress thought. It cannot anticipate the choices of countless minds acting independently. The balance had shifted. Not entirely. Not yet. But perceptibly. And once the balance tilts, it rarely returns to its original state. He looked over the skyline, neon lights reflecting in puddles on the street. Windows glimmered with ordinary lives. Each one holding a spark of awareness, courage, and choice. The storm had arrived quietly. But the wind was unmistakable. And the people, once passive, were no longer just observers, they were participants. The balance had shifted. And the system would never be the same. The storm had arrived fully. Not in chaos, not in flames, not in sirens. It arrived in minds. In hearts. In the quiet certainty that obedience is optional. People realized something fundamental. They were not merely cogs in a machine. They were human. They had agency. They had choice. And with that realization, everything changed. He walked through streets that glimmered in neon rain. Windows reflected ordinary lives, people awake, questioning, deciding for themselves. Teachers no longer followed scripts, they taught truth. Students no longer parroted narratives, they analyzed. Clerks no longer obeyed blindly, they discerned. Journalists no longer repeated spin, they investigated. Every small act of defiance, once quiet and invisible, had converged into a force that could not be ignored. The system, polished and precise, had done everything it could. It had tried subtle coercion. It had tried incentives. It had tried distraction. And it had failed. Because awareness cannot be silenced. Consciousness cannot be caged. Truth, once recognized, spreads relentlessly. The human awakening had arrived. In a quiet cafe, he overheard a conversation. They thought we would never question. They underestimated us. Everything is different now, even if it's subtle. Recognition. Reflection. Choice. It was not dramatic. It was not violent. It was deeply human. And in that humanity lay unstoppable power. He remembered the first sparks that began it all. The teacher, the clerk, the mother, the student. Each small act had been a seed. Each quiet defiance had been a ripple. And together, they had become a tide. A storm. A human awakening. The realization was simple, yet profound. Power is not absolute. Obedience is optional. Freedom is never given, it is reclaimed. He paused at the edge of the city, looking over the skyline. Neon lights shimmered in puddles on the streets. The wind carried the soft hum of lives awake. Ordinary lives. Ordinary people. Extraordinary courage. The storm had passed, yet its impact lingered. Not in rubble. Not in headlines. But in human consciousness. And he knew, this awakening would ripple further. It could not be contained. It would grow. It would endure. Because the most powerful force in any system is the human mind. That refuses to be silent. The storm had passed. The tide had settled. And the city, like the people in it, was changed. Not visibly. Not in headlines. Not in monuments or proclamations. But in the quiet understanding that everything could be questioned. Everything could be challenged. And freedom is not granted, it is claimed. He walked through streets bathed in neon reflections. Windows glimmered with ordinary lives. Each one alive with choice, awareness, and courage. Teachers spoke truth. Students questioned boldly. Clerks acted with conscience. Journalists reported without fear. The currents of human awakening were now a river, steady and enduring. Invisible to those who relied on control. But undeniable to those who had learned to see. The system still functioned. Polished. Precise. But no longer absolute. Authority had been reminded of a simple truth. Power is fragile when minds are awake. Control is temporary when people remember their agency. Illusions of certainty crumble when questioned. And people remembered. In a quiet diner, he overheard a child ask. Why did they think we would just follow? And a parent replied, softly. Because they forgot, sometimes the smallest voices are the loudest. Recognition. Reflection. Hope. The city was calm. But beneath the surface, currents of courage continued to flow. Awareness had become permanent. Humanity had reasserted itself. He paused at the edge of the skyline, looking down at the city. Neon lights shimmered in puddles. Rain tapped softly on the pavement. Every reflection was a story. Every light, a choice. Every life, a spark. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It is passed down. It is earned. It is reclaimed, one brave choice at a time. And when your moment comes, when the world asks you to obey or think, what will you choose? If this story made you pause, reflect, or awaken, share it. Because truth survives only when it is told. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is how it all begins again. And maybe, that's how it always has.